Please be aware this story contains descriptions of sexual assault. Mohamed Al-Fayed, the former owner of Harrods, who died last year, was a serial sexual abuser on the scale of Harvey Weinstein or Jimmy Savile. That's the claim made today by the barrister representing 37 women who claim to have been subjected to his abuse.
I have many years of practice, and I have never seen a case as horrific as this. This case combines some of the most horrific elements of the cases involving Jimmy Savile, Jeffrey Epstein, and Harvey Weinstein. Savile, because in this case, as in that, the institution, we say, knew about the behaviour. Epstein, because in that case, as in this, there was a procurement system in place to source the women and girls, as you know, there are some very young victims of this, for abuse. And Weinstein, because it was a person at the very top of the organisation who was abusing his power. We will say it plainly, Mohamed Al-Fayed was a monster.
That press conference was called to announce a civil case against Harrods for allegedly facilitating Al-Fayed's abuse. And it follows the airing of a BBC documentary last night that interviewed numerous survivors of Al-Fayed's alleged abuse. Now, according to that investigation, Fayed was accused of raping 5 women and sexually abusing at least 15 others when they worked for him at Harrods. And one survivor also spoke at this afternoon's press conference.
Mohamed Al-Fayed, a sick predator, lured me in by using the same modus operandi he used time and time again. I was subjected to an unnecessary and intrusive medical examination. I was never given those results. I was subjected to AIDS and STD testing without consent, and now believe in hindsight, I was checked for my purity. We would be sent to see Al-Fayed because he had a job for us to do. It was always more of a friendly chat than actual work. But then these private meetings turned into more. A forced kiss. His hands gripping your face to his lips, or pulling you down on his lap, where his hands were free to explore any part of your body that he wished. One night I was asked to stay late. This was to be my final night. All of MAF's, or Mohamed Al-Fayed's planning and manipulation were to come to fruition. He summoned me up to his private apartment on the pretext of a job review. I was escorted by one of his security guards who ushered me into his private sitting room. The door was locked behind me. Al-Fayed handed me a glass of champagne and told me to sit. Looking around, I saw his bedroom door partially open. There were sex toys on view. I felt petrified. I perched myself at the very end of the sofa, and then it came. Mohamed Al-Fayed, my boss, the person I work for, pushed himself onto me. I fell to the floor with him still on top of me, but I managed to kick free and free myself. I ran towards the door. I told him I was meeting my father for dinner and he would be worried that I was late. He just laughed at me. He then composed himself and he told me in no uncertain terms that I was never to breathe a word of this to anyone. If I did, I would never work in London again, and he knew where my family lived.
According to the BBC investigation, the abuse described there was systematic at Harrods. So they write this: the Harrods owner would regularly tour the department store's vast sales floors and identify young female assistants he found attractive, who would then be promoted to work in his offices upstairs, former staff, male and female, told us. The assaults would be carried out in Harrods' offices, in Fayed's London apartment, or on foreign trips, often in Paris, at the Ritz Hotel, which he also owned, or his nearby Villa Windsor property. At Harrods, other former staff members told us it was clear what was happening. Quote, "We all watched each other walk through that door thinking, you poor girl, it's you today, and feeling utterly powerless to stop it," unquote. Alice, not her real name, says. All the women who spoke to the BBC described having felt intimidated at work, making it difficult for them to speak out. And the BBC uncovered how phones were tapped and CCTV used to monitor female staff. A former security executive at Harrods told the documentary, Fayed bugged everybody that he wanted to bug. Now, it all sounds completely horrific, and the manner in which Fayed was able to cover up his abuse is also shocking. This is from that BBC report. There were a number of attempts to expose Fayed before his death, notably by Vanity Fair in 1995, with an article alleging racism, staff surveillance, and sexual misconduct. This sparked a libel lawsuit. Mohamed Fayed later agreed to drop the case as long as all the further evidence the magazine had gathered of his sexual misconduct in preparation for a trial was locked away. Fayed's settlement was negotiated by a senior Harrods executive. Now, the fact Fayed had success in making those legal threats allowed him to continue his alleged abuse for more than a decade. The BBC spoke to a woman, Gemma, who worked as one of Fayed's personal assistants between 2007 and 2009. She says she was raped by Fayed on a work trip to Paris. Gemma left her job after that and reached a settlement with Harrods, but that was on condition of her signing an NDA, so a non-disclosure agreement. She described that process in the documentary.
The agreement for me leaving was I had to shred all of the evidence, and in return, I would be given a sum of money and would be left alone. The lawyers organised for a shredding truck to come to my lawyer's office, where we placed everything in. It was shredded in front of us, including tapes I had of him, my phone that had messages and voicemails, really quite nasty voicemails on them. Someone from HR was present for the shredding of all of the evidence I had. Harrods, I think they knew the significance of having this kind of information available. I think they just wanted to get rid of it as quick as possible and get rid of me as quick as possible. I thought I'd lost the transcripts, but actually what I did have was the transcriptions sent to my lawyer in my sent items of my email account at the time. I was advised it would be in my best interest not to talk, that I was to keep it quiet. All these years not being able to talk about something that's so unfair, like so unfair to make somebody go through something like that and then expect them not to talk about it. It's cruel.
So many women who've been through such a horrific experience, not only sort of subject to abuse, but then being completely silenced. And researching this story today, it was the missed opportunities, especially in the 1990s, to properly expose Fayed that seemed the most puzzling and infuriating. There were lots of journalistic attempts that sort of almost outed him or exposed parts of his practices, personality, behavior, but it never quite stuck, or there was always some sort of barrier towards him being properly exposed and any kind of justice being achieved. And earlier today, I spoke to someone with an insider's perspective on how Fayed got away with his alleged abuse. Henry Porter is an investigative journalist who worked for Condé Nast, that's the publisher of Vanity Fair, when they were defending themselves against a libel claim brought against them by Mohamed Fayed.
We started in 95, we got a writ from Fayed after a piece by Maureen Orth. And that piece was set out to be a flattering piece of Fayed because the Americans were keen on this anti-establishment clown and thought that he was making a mockery of the British society. Well, Maureen's a very good reporter, and she found out that he was a routine sexual abuser. He bugged his staff, he filmed them, and he was an out-and-out racist. And we ran a piece with all those things in it. And we received the libel suit, the defamation case, notice of it, about early on in 95. And from then on till the summer of 97, I spent my life investigating Fayed and all these allegations, which we stood up. I've just been reading the documents again. We stood up to the point where we, in August of 95, delivered a re-amended case of 800 pages with allegations of criminality, which the judge knew would sink Fayed. But then, 27 days later, or whatever it was, Fayed son was killed with Princess Di, and we settled.
Reading about this today in the BBC, it says that Mohamed Al Fayed later agreed to drop the case, or the libel case, as long as all further evidence the magazine had gathered of his sexual misconduct in preparation for the trial was locked away. Now, that seems to me, why did Condé Nast agree to do that, to sort of lock away evidence as part of an agreement? Because, looking back on that now, that does seem, unfortunate to say the least. What was going on there?
It was completely unnecessary. And I think it was wrong. I think it was morally wrong. But I didn't make the agreement. I felt it was wrong because we had evidence of serious criminality. And we had 7 affidavits from women who'd been sexually abused. They hadn't been raped, any of our witnesses, but they'd been sexually abused in a criminal manner. And I thought it was completely wrong. But I think it's basically money talking. Condé Nast at the time would have wanted the return of Harrods advertising. They simply wanted the issue, the problem to go away. I mean, I had spent all my time on this for 18 months. We'd spent about £1 million on the defense of the case. And I had been given an unlimited budget to see it right, which we had done. And I agree. I mean, not all the evidence was locked away. I mean, I have it, if I can go off camera for a moment, many files of it here. And I kept my evidence on the grounds that a lot of it was my copyright, memos I had written. And I also felt very strongly that we shouldn't hide away testimony which was evidence of Fayed's criminality. And I made it available to journalists in the last 27 years.
I'm puzzled by this. It just seems surprising that, we're in 2024, this is all being exposed, and it seems like people like yourself have had documentary evidence of this since the 90s, and you've just said you've made it available to people. So, I mean, how should our audience understand how it was able to be the case that Mohamed Al Fayed could, I mean, if we're believing the allegations, which do seem incredibly credible, not only to sort of not have justice for those women he abused in the 90s, but to go on abusing women, including raping women, because this never became, I suppose, properly public? I mean, it seems to me in some degree it was public. Can you sort of explain to our audience how this was able to happen for so long in plain sight?
Well, I can tell you, he was a very vindictive man, and he used his lawyers to threaten and browbeat organizations which were less rich and less determined than we were. I couldn't continue with our case, so I have to say I argued in a 4-page memo dated June the 5th, 1997, that we had a moral responsibility to continue with it, not as a company, but as a publication. And, I made available, anyone ever came to me and asked for our material, I just made available what material I had and wished them well. But very few people were willing to take on Fayed. So it wasn't just a question of us hiding our material. It was a question of also people being bamboozled by the reputation he had for legal actions.
Obviously, he died last year. Do you think that's why this is coming out now? Because journalists or media owners, I'm not sure, you can tell me which, were so scared of Mohamed Al Fayed that they had to wait for him to die before actually exposing the truth about what he did.
I think that's 50% true. I think the other part of it is that, the women that I dealt with and the women in that film were genuinely frightened, and they had reason to be, because there were, Fayed would go after his enemies and he would intimidate them in any manner that he could. When we were working on this, we hid our witnesses, and they were still incredibly frightened, even with a big, powerful organization like ours behind them, backing them. They were still frightened. So you've got to remember that the witnesses wouldn't come forward. I mean, one talked to me 18 months ago, so that was about 9 months before, around 6 months before Fayed died. And she was really unwilling to go on the record. A woman in her 50s whose life had been destroyed by Fayed's sexual predation. And she wouldn't go on the record, still won't, as a matter of fact. So you've got to remember that atmosphere of fear also contributed to his safety.
The women being represented today, so the people who gave this press conference with their barrister, they're trying to take a civil case against Harrods. Do you think there are other institutions and organizations that should be held accountable for what's happened over the past 30 years? Because it seems like there were many missed opportunities from many different parties to stop this going on.
Like what? Like what other institutions?
Well, I suppose media organizations. As I say, I'm fairly new to this case, so I'm asking this in quite an open-minded way, but it seems as if there has been a broader failure to expose this if it's been in plain sight for such a long time. Why, for example, didn't the BBC do a documentary such as this 20 years ago?
Well, evidently because of the risk. There's a lot of inertia and resistance when you go to a publisher or an editor and say, I've got this and it's likely to invoke a legal case. Yeah. I would say, I don't think you can imagine suing anyone or holding anyone else to account. I do believe something that hasn't been mentioned today, that the 5 or 6 doctors who carried out medical examinations for Al-Fayed and sent directly to his flat the results of those medical examinations, which were often invasive, should be held to account. And some of them are still alive. I tracked one down this afternoon. And I think they are certainly one group of people who I would hold responsible for this appalling scandal.
Now, Al-Fayed people will associate this with many other cases where sort of systematic sexual abuse has been uncovered from very powerful men. So you can think Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, Jimmy Savile, all, I suppose, sort of carrying out their abuse in a sort of similar time frame. Is it the case that sort of we're uncovering this all now because sort of it takes a while for this to happen, or do you think this is now a thing of the recent past? And given Me Too, it would now be difficult for someone with the profile of men like this to carry out abuse as sort of outlandish and systematic as they have? Or do you think that there are clearly going to be many Mohamed Al-Fayed still acting in this way right now and still using their lawyers to threaten people not to write about it?
I don't think that's so likely now. I mean, I think if the Fayed case had been, 15 to 20 years later, he wouldn't have even sued us. And the people would be much, much more willing to talk to us. And so I think the Me Too dam I think it was 2017, really, really mattered and has changed things for the better and for good. And I think also media organizations would be slightly more prepared to take it on. Not terribly well prepared, because, you will find that the major investigation, say, into Harvey Weinstein was taken on by Jonathan Newhouse's New Yorker and then the New York Times, both of them rich and powerful organizations. We don't have that kind of organization unless you're talking about the Daily Mail, the Daily or Rupert Murdoch's newspapers. And they are not disposed towards these investigations generally.
That's interesting. So you think in a way, sort of the BBC doesn't even have, even if it had the desire, it doesn't have the money to sort of take on things as risky as this.
It doesn't have the money, and I don't think it has the will. I mean, I think the BBC is incredibly weak in its news department. I think where it's become stronger and is doing good work is in documentaries. And that, I think, was proven by these 2 young women who were, after all, children when I first started investigating this. The 2 young women who produced and directed the film have done a really, really good job. And they've done it because they've done it well, because it's a really sensitive, difficult thing to pull off, and they've done it really well.